The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of the timber-framed boarding house, and Zelda Grayson pressed her gloved hand against the window, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. Beside her, her younger sister Violet clutched a worn carpetbag and stared out at the dusty streets of Concord, California, with eyes that had not quite lost their fear since their parents died 6 months ago. It was September 1876, and Zelda had traveled over 2,000 miles to marry a man she had never met, a rancher named Warren Finch who needed a wife and had placed an advertisement in a Boston newspaper that promised a good home and honest work. "Is that him?" Violet whispered, her voice barely audible over the creaking of the coach as the driver climbed down from his perch. Zelda followed her sister's gaze to a tall figure standing in the shadow of the building across the street. Even from this distance, she could make out broad shoulders beneath a dark shirt, a hat pulled low over his face, and boots dusty from what must have been a long ride into town. Her stomach twisted with anxiety and something else she could not quite name. "I do not know," Zelda admitted. "But I suppose we will find out soon enough." The driver opened the door with a flourish that seemed excessive for their humble appearance, and Zelda gathered her skirts to step down onto the wooden sidewalk. The heat of the California afternoon hit her like a physical thing, so different from the cool autumn air she had left behind in Massachusetts. Violet followed close behind, nearly stepping on Zelda's heels in her nervousness. The man across the street straightened and began walking toward them with long, purposeful strides. As he drew closer, Zelda could see a strong jaw shadowed with stubble, eyes the color of weathered oak, and a mouth set in a line that suggested he smiled about as often as it rained in this dry country. He stopped a few feet away and removed his hat, revealing dark brown hair that curled slightly at the ends. "Miss Grayson." His voice was deep and rough like gravel underfoot. "Yes, Zelda Grayson." She lifted her chin, determined not to show how her knees were shaking beneath her traveling dress. "This is my sister, Violet. I wrote to you about her in my last letter." Warren Finch's gaze shifted to the girl standing half behind Zelda, and something in his expression softened almost imperceptibly. Violet was only 15, small for her age, with the same auburn hair as Zelda but eyes that were a clearer green. She looked like what she was, a frightened child who had lost everything familiar and was now standing in a strange town, dependent on the charity of strangers. "I remember," Warren said simply. "You said she had nowhere else to go." "I could not leave her behind," Zelda said, and she heard the defensive edge in her own voice. "If that changes the arrangement, I understand, but I will not be separated from her. She is all the family I have left." Warren was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving between the two sisters. Then he settled his hat back on his head and reached for the trunk the driver had unloaded onto the sidewalk. "The ranch is about an hour's ride from here. I brought the wagon." It was not exactly an answer, but Zelda chose to take it as acceptance. Relief flooded through her so suddenly she felt light-headed. She had been prepared to argue, to plead if necessary, but Warren Finch had simply picked up their belongings and was already walking toward a wagon hitched at the end of the street. Violet's hand found Zelda's, squeezing tight. "He seems stern," she whispered. "He seems practical," Zelda corrected, though privately she thought her sister might be right. Warren Finch was not the warm, welcoming husband she had allowed herself to imagine during the long journey west. But then again, she had not come here looking for romance. She had come looking for survival, for a roof over their heads and food on the table, and a future that did not involve slowly starving in a Boston tenement while trying to support them both on a seamstress's wages. They followed Warren to the wagon, and he helped them up onto the bench seat with hands that were strong and calloused but surprisingly gentle. Zelda found herself acutely aware of the brief contact, the warmth of his palm through her glove. She settled her skirts around her and pulled Violet close as Warren climbed up beside them and took the reins. The ride out of town was quiet except for the steady clop of the horses' hooves and the creak of the wagon wheels. Zelda watched the landscape roll past, so different from anything she had known. The hills were golden brown, dotted with dark green oaks that provided precious little shade. In the distance, she could see mountains rising purple against the horizon. Everything seemed bigger here, wider, as though the sky had been stretched to cover more ground than it was meant to. "The ranch has been in my family for 15 years, Warren said suddenly, breaking the silence. "My father claimed the land and built the house. When he died 2 years ago, it came to me. It is not much, but it is good grazing land. I run about 200 head of cattle, some horses." Zelda glanced at his profile, surprised by this offering of information. "It sounds like substantial work for one man." "I have 2 hired hands who help with the cattle drives and branding. The rest I can manage." He paused, then added, "The house needs a woman's touch. I am not much good at cooking or keeping things clean. That is part of why I sent for a wife." It was perhaps the most unromantic proposal of marriage Zelda had ever heard, but there was an honesty to it that she appreciated. At least Warren Finch was not pretending this was anything other than what it was: a business arrangement between 2 people who needed something from each other. "I am a good cook," she said, "and I know how to keep a house. My mother taught me before she passed." Warren nodded, his eyes on the road ahead. They lapsed back into silence, but it felt slightly less awkward now, as though they had established some basic understanding of what would be expected. The ranch appeared gradually as they crested a low hill. Zelda saw a 2-story house built of timber and stone, solid and practical like the man beside her. There was a barn, a corral with several horses, and a scattering of outbuildings she could not identify from this distance. Trees had been planted around the house, still young but providing some shade, and she could see the glint of water from what must be a creek or stream nearby. "It is beautiful," Violet breathed, and Zelda had to agree. After weeks of traveling, of dusty train stations and cramped stage coaches and uncertain futures, this looked like home. Warren pulled the wagon up in front of the house and set the brake. "I will show you inside," he said, climbing down and coming around to help them descend. The interior of the house was dim and cool after the bright heat outside. Zelda's eyes adjusted to reveal a large main room with a stone fireplace, a wooden table with chairs, and furnishings that were sparse but well made. Everything was clean but bare, lacking the small touches that made a house feel lived in. Curtains on the windows, rugs on the floor, pictures on the walls. "There are 3 bedrooms upstairs," Warren said, leading them toward a narrow staircase. "I use the largest one. I thought you and your sister could take the other 2, or share one if you prefer." Zelda felt her cheeks warm at the implication behind those words. They would not be sharing a bedroom, at least not immediately. She was grateful for the consideration, even as part of her wondered what it said about his expectations for their marriage. The room he showed her was small but clean, with a simple bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the hills. Violet's room was next door, equally modest. Her sister immediately went to the window and pressed her face against the glass, drinking in the view. "I have never seen so much space," Violet said softly. "It goes on forever." Warren stood in the doorway, his hat in his hands. "I will bring up your trunk." There is a well out back for water, and the outhouse is behind the barn. Supper is usually at sundown, but I do not expect you to cook tonight. You must be tired from traveling. I do not mind, Zelda said quickly. If you show me where things are kept, I can make something simple. Something shifted in Warren's expression, though she could not quite rate it. If you are sure, I will get your things settled first. He left them alone, and Zelda sank down onto the bed, suddenly aware of how exhausted she was. The journey had taken nearly 3 weeks, and she had not slept well since leaving Boston, always worrying about what lay ahead, whether she had made the right choice in answering Warren Finch's advertisement. Violet came to sit beside her, leaning her head on Zelda's shoulder. "Are you going to marry him?" she asked quietly. "That was the arrangement," Zelda replied, "though I suppose we will have to find a preacher and make it official. Do you like him?" Zelda considered the question. "I do not know him well enough to say, but he seems like a good man." "He did not have to agree to take you as well, but he did. He barely said a word about it," Violet pointed out. "Sometimes actions speak louder than words." Zelda straightened and smoothed her skirts. "Come, let us freshen up before I start supper. We should make a good impression." Warren showed her the kitchen, which was attached to the back of the house, and contained a large iron stove, shelves stocked with basic provisions, and a work table scarred from years of use. Zelda found flour and lard and managed to make biscuits, and there was salt pork that she fried up with some slightly wizened potatoes she discovered in a bin. It was simple fare, but it was hot and filling, and when she called the men to table, she felt a small surge of pride. She had expected just Warren, but 2 other men came in with him, removing their hats and nodding politely at the sisters. Warren introduced them as Jake and Samuel, the hired hands he had mentioned. They were both young, probably in their early 20s, and they looked at Zelda and Violet with the kind of barely concealed curiosity that made Zelda acutely aware of how rare women must be out here. But it was what happened next that would replay in Zelda's mind for days afterward. Warren had set 4 places at the table, 1 for each of them. He glanced at Violet, who was standing uncertainly by the stove, clearly not sure if she was expected to eat with them or wait until after. Without a word, Warren walked to the shelf, took down another plate, and set it at the table beside Zelda's place. It was such a small gesture, barely worth noting, but something about it made Zelda's throat tighten. He had not asked, had not made a show of it, had simply seen a need and addressed it. She caught his eye across the table, wanting to thank him, but he had already turned away to take his seat. They ate in relative silence, though Jake and Samuel snuck glances at the sisters between bites. The food disappeared quickly, and Zelda made a mental note to cook larger portions in the future. These were men who worked hard physical labor all day. They would have hearty appetites. "That was real good, Miss Grayson," Jake said when he had finished, his face reddening slightly as he spoke. "We have not had biscuits like that in a long time." "Not since we had biscuits at all," Samuel added with a grin. "Warren here tends toward beans and jerky." "I keep us fed," Warren said mildly. "That is all that matters." "Well, now you will have proper meals," Zelda said, gathering the empty plates. "I will do my best to make sure of it." After the men had gone back outside to finish the evening chores, Violet helped Zelda clean up the kitchen. They worked in comfortable silence, falling into the familiar rhythm they had developed over the months since their parents' deaths. Zelda washed while Violet dried, and together they put everything back in its proper place. "He is not what I expected," Violet said eventually. "No." Zelda scrubbed at a stubborn spot on one of the plates. "What did you expect?" "I do not know. Someone older, perhaps. Someone who talked more." Violet was quiet for a moment, then added, "Someone less handsome." Zelda felt her cheeks warm again. She had noticed Warren's looks, of course she had, but she had been trying not to dwell on them. It seemed dangerous to think of him that way, as anything other than the practical solution to their problems that he represented. "He is our host and my future husband," Zelda said firmly. "That is all that matters." But that night, lying in the unfamiliar bed and listening to the sounds of the ranch settling around her, Zelda could not help but think about the way Warren had set that extra plate down without hesitation, without making Violet feel like a burden or an afterthought. It spoke to a kindness that his stern exterior did not advertise, and it made her wonder what other qualities might be hidden beneath that quiet, practical surface. The next few days fell into a pattern. Zelda woke before dawn and started breakfast while Warren and his men saw to the animals. She cooked and cleaned and began to put her stamp on the house, sewing curtains from fabric she found in a trunk upstairs, arranging wildflowers in jars on the table and windowsills. Violet helped where she could, but Zelda could see her sister was restless, used to the bustle of city life and not quite sure what to do with herself in this vast, quiet landscape. Warren was gone most of the day, working the ranch, but he came in for meals and was always polite, always quietly appreciative of the changes Zelda was making. They had not discussed when they would actually get married, and Zelda found herself reluctant to bring it up. There was something comfortable about this liminal space they occupied, not quite strangers but not yet husband and wife. On the fourth day, Warren came in from the morning chores and found Zelda kneading bread at the kitchen table. Violet was upstairs making the beds, and they were alone for the first time since that initial wagon ride. "I need to go into town tomorrow to pick up supplies," he said, standing awkwardly in the doorway. "I thought perhaps you and Violet might want to come along. You could meet some of the neighbors, see more of Concord." Zelda looked up from the dough, surprised and pleased. "We would like that very much." Warren nodded, but he did not leave. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clearly working up to saying something else. Finally, he cleared his throat and said, "There is a preacher in town, Reverend Matthews. If you are agreeable, we could speak with him about performing a ceremony." There it was, the question that had been hovering between them. Zelda's hand stilled in the dough. "Is that what you want?" "It is why you came here," Warren said, and she noticed he had not exactly answered her question. "It seems we should make it official, unless you have changed your mind." "I have not changed my mind," Zelda said quickly. Then, more softly, "Have you?" For the first time since she had met him, Warren's expression opened slightly, revealing something that might have been vulnerability. "No, you have been good for this place. For me. I would be honored if you would agree to marry me proper-like." It was not a declaration of love, but it was honest and earnest, and Zelda found that she valued that more than pretty words would have meant. "Then yes, I will speak with the Reverend tomorrow." Something like relief crossed Warren's face. "Good. That is good." He started to turn away, then paused. "Zelda, I want you to know that I will do right by you and your sister. You do not need to worry about anything." "I know," Zelda said, and realized she meant it. Whatever else Warren Finch might be, he was a man of his word. The trip into town the next day was a revelation. Zelda had been too nervous on her arrival to take much notice of Concord, but now she looked at it with new eyes, trying to see it as someone who would be living here for the rest of her life. The town was small but growing, with a main street lined with shops and businesses. There was a general store, a bank, a saloon, a blacksmith, and a handful of other establishments. People moved with purpose along the wooden sidewalks, and she noticed several women among them, which eased something in her chest. She would not be completely isolated out here. Warren helped her and Violet down from the wagon in front of the general store, and immediately several people turned to look. A middle-aged woman with kind eyes and graying hair approached with a smile. "Warren Finch, Is this the bride everyone has been talking about?" she asked, her voice warm and friendly. Warren actually looked slightly uncomfortable at being the subject of town gossip, but he made the introductions. "This is Zelda Grayson and her sister Violet. This is Mrs. Porter. She runs the boarding house where you arrived." "It is lovely to meet you properly," Mrs. Porter said, taking Zelda's hand. "We are so glad to have more women in town. You must come to the ladies' social next week. We meet every Thursday afternoon." "I would like that," Zelda said, genuinely pleased at the invitation. Mrs. Porter's eyes shifted to Violet, who was hanging back shyly. "And how old are you, dear?" "15, madam," Violet said quietly. "Perfect age for school. We have a schoolhouse just down the street. The teacher, Miss Hartwell, is wonderful. You should enroll." Violet's eyes widened, and Zelda saw a spark of interest there. Her sister had always loved learning, and their parents had scrimped and saved to keep her in school back in Boston. The idea that she could continue her education here had not even occurred to Zelda. "Could I?" Violet asked, looking between Zelda and Warren. "I do not see why not," Warren said before Zelda could answer. "School is important." They spent the next hour in the general store, where Warren introduced them to the proprietor and helped Zelda select supplies. She tried not to be too extravagant, conscious of the expense, but Warren encouraged her to get whatever she needed for the household. She picked out fabric for new dresses for both her and Violet, thread and needles, spices and staples for the kitchen, and a few small luxuries like real coffee and sugar. When everything was tallied, Warren paid without hesitation, though Zelda noticed the amount was substantial. As they loaded the purchases into the wagon, she touched his arm lightly. "Thank you," she said. "You have been very generous." Warren glanced down at her hand on his sleeve, and Zelda quickly withdrew it, suddenly aware of the intimacy of the gesture. But he did not seem bothered. "You are going to be my wife. What is mine is yours." They found Reverend Matthews at the small church at the end of the main street. He was an older man with a shock of white hair and a gentle demeanor that immediately put Zelda at ease. When Warren explained their situation, the Reverend nodded as though he had been expecting them. "I heard you had sent for a mail-order bride," he said to Warren. "Half the town has been speculating about when you would make it official." Warren looked pained at this further evidence of being a subject of gossip, and Zelda found herself fighting a smile. There was something endearing about his discomfort with being the center of attention. "We would like to marry as soon as possible," Zelda said, "if that can be arranged." "How about Sunday?" Reverend Matthews suggested. "After the regular service. That way folks can witness it, make it a proper celebration." Zelda's stomach fluttered with nerves. Sunday was only 5 days away. 5 days until she would be married to a man she had known for less than a week. But she had come too far to lose her nerve now. Sunday would be fine, she agreed. Warren reached out and took her hand, his grip warm and solid. "Sunday it is, then." The ride back to the ranch was quiet, but it was a comfortable quiet. Violet had fallen asleep against Zelda's shoulder, exhausted from the excitement of the day, and Zelda found herself very aware of Warren's presence beside her on the wagon bench. He handled the reins with easy confidence, his attention on the road, and she took the opportunity to study him more closely. He had a good face, she decided. Strong and honest, with lines around his eyes that suggested he squinted against the sun more often than he smiled, but also a mouth that looked like it might be generous when it did curve upward. His hands on the reins were capable and sure, the hands of a man who knew how to work and was not afraid of it. As if sensing her scrutiny, Warren turned his head and met her eyes. For a long moment they simply looked at each other, and Zelda felt something shift in her chest, a flutter of possibility. "You are going to be a good husband," she said softly, surprising herself with the declaration. Warren's expression softened. "I am going to try my damnedest to be." The rest of the week passed in a blur of preparation. Zelda threw herself into making the house as welcoming as possible, determined that, when she became mistress of this ranch in truth, it would be a home worth being proud of. She sewed new curtains for the parlor, baked bread and pies, and even convinced Warren to help her plant a small vegetable garden near the kitchen. Working beside him in the dirt, she discovered that he had a dry sense of humor that emerged when he was relaxed. He told her stories about the ranch, about his father who had been a stern but fair man, about the first winter they had spent here when the snows had been so deep they could not get into town for 2 months. She told him about Boston, about growing up in a cramped apartment with parents who worked themselves to exhaustion to provide for their daughters, about the hole their deaths had left. "I am sorry you lost them," Warren said, patting the soil around a tomato seedling. "But I am glad you are here now." "So am I," Zelda replied, and meant it. Violet enrolled in school and came home each day bubbling with excitement about what she had learned, about the other students, about Miss Hartwell, who was young and pretty and made learning fun. Zelda was grateful to see her sister coming back to life, shedding some of the grief and fear that had weighed her down for so long. Saturday evening, the night before the wedding, Zelda was in the kitchen preparing supper when Warren came in earlier than usual. He was freshly washed, his hair still damp, wearing a clean shirt she had not seen before. "I wanted to talk to you," he said, standing in the doorway in that way he had, as though uncertain of his welcome. "Before tomorrow." Zelda set down the spoon she had been using to stir the stew and wiped her hands on her apron. "Of course." Warren came further into the room, but he did not quite meet her eyes. "I know this is not a conventional marriage. We barely know each other. But I want you to know that I take my vows seriously. When I say I will honor and protect you, I mean it." "I know you do," Zelda said gently. "I am not good with words," Warren continued, as though she had not spoken, "and I am not a romantic man. I can promise you a roof over your head and food on your table and safety, but I cannot promise you poetry or grand gestures." Zelda crossed the space between them and placed her hand on his arm, making him look at her. "Warren, I do not need poetry. I need exactly what you are offering: a good man, an honest life, a home for me and my sister. You have already given us more than we had any right to expect." Warren covered her hand with his own, and the warmth of his touch sent a shiver through her. "I will try to make you happy," he said quietly. "You already do," Zelda whispered, and realized as she said it that it was true. This quiet, steady man had somehow worked his way past her defenses without her even noticing. Warren's eyes darkened, and for a moment Zelda thought he might kiss her. Her heart began to race, her lips parting slightly in anticipation. But then Violet's footsteps sounded on the stairs and Warren stepped back, releasing her hand. "Tomorrow, then," he said, his voice slightly rough. "Tomorrow," Zelda agreed. The wedding was a simple affair held in the small church after the Sunday service. Zelda wore a new dress she had made from the blue fabric Warren had bought her in town, and Violet had woven wildflowers into her hair. Warren wore a dark suit that made his shoulders look even broader, and when Zelda walked down the short aisle toward him, she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. The ceremony itself was brief. They exchanged vows in front of Reverend Matthews and what seemed like half the town, who had all turned out to witness this unusual union. When the Reverend pronounced them man and wife and told Warren he could kiss his bride, Zelda's heart began to pound. Warren cupped her face gently in his calloused hands and leaned down to press his lips to hers. It was a chaste kiss, appropriate for a church full of onlookers, but Zelda felt it all the way to her toes. When he pulled back, she saw her own surprise reflected in his eyes, as though he too had felt that spark of connection. Mrs. Porter had organized a small reception at her boarding house, with cake and lemonade and enough food to feed everyone twice over. People came up to congratulate them, and Zelda found herself overwhelmed by the warmth and welcome of this community. Women she had never met offered advice and friendship. Men clapped Warren on the back and told him he was a lucky man. Through it all, Warren stayed close to her side, his hand at the small of her back or his arm around her waist, small gestures of possession and protection that made Zelda feel cherished in a way she never had before. As the sun began to set, Warren leaned down to murmur in her ear, "Are you ready to go home, Mrs. Finch, Mrs. Finch?" Zelda tested the name in her mind and found she liked it. "Yes, I think I am." They collected Violet, who had been playing with some of the other children, and made their way to the wagon. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, all three of them tired but content. Violet fell asleep almost immediately, and Zelda leaned against Warren's shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him. "Thank you for today," she said softly. "It was perfect." Warren pressed a kiss to the top of her head, a gesture so natural and affectionate it made Zelda's eyes prickle with unexpected tears. "You are welcome." When they arrived home, Warren carried Violet upstairs to her room, the girl barely stirring as he laid her on the bed. Zelda followed to remove her sister's shoes and pull a quilt over her, then found Warren waiting in the hallway. The awareness of what typically happened on a wedding night hung between them, unspoken but present. Zelda felt her cheeks warm, her heart racing with a mixture of nerves and anticipation. Warren seemed to sense her anxiety. "We do not have to do anything you are not ready for," he said quietly. "I meant what I said about not rushing you." Zelda looked up at this man who was now her husband, this good, patient, kind man, and felt her heart expand with an emotion she was not quite ready to name. "I am not afraid," she said. "Not of you." Warren's eyes darkened with something that made her stomach flutter. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering on her cheek. "Zelda," he said, and her name on his lips sounded like a prayer. She rose up on her toes and kissed him, and this time there was no audience, no need for restraint. Warren's arms came around her, pulling her close, and Zelda melted into his embrace. The kiss deepened, became more urgent, and when Warren finally pulled back, they were both breathing hard. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice rough with desire and the need to confirm her consent. "I am sure," Zelda whispered. Warren swept her up into his arms and carried her to his room, their room now, and kicked the door shut behind them. He set her down gently beside the bed and began to help her with the buttons of her dress, his fingers fumbling slightly with nervousness. Zelda found his uncertainty endearing, proof that this meant something to him beyond just the physical. She helped him, and then helped him with his own clothes, and when they finally came together in the big bed, it was with a tenderness that brought tears to Zelda's eyes. Warren was gentle and patient, murmuring endearments against her skin, making sure she was with him every step of the way. And when it was over and they lay tangled together in the sheets, Zelda felt a sense of belonging that she had not experienced since her parents died. "Are you all right?" Warren asked, his hand stroking lazy circles on her back. "More than all right," Zelda assured him, pressing a kiss to his chest. "That was wonderful." Warren chuckled, a sound she had rarely heard from him. "You are easy to please, Mrs. Finch." "Or you are better than you give yourself credit for, Mr. Finch." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, and when Zelda woke in the middle of the night to find herself still held close against Warren's chest, she felt a peace she had not known was possible. The next weeks fell into a new rhythm. Zelda rose early to make breakfast for her husband and his men, packed lunches for Warren and Violet, and spent her days keeping the house and tending the garden. In the evenings, Warren would come in dusty and tired, and they would eat together as a family, Violet chattering about school while Warren listened with patient interest. At night, after Violet had gone to bed, Warren and Zelda would retire to their room, and Zelda discovered that her quiet, reserved husband was surprisingly passionate behind closed doors. He made love to her with an intensity that left her breathless, and afterward they would talk in the darkness, sharing stories and dreams and slowly learning each other's hearts. One evening about a month after the wedding, Zelda was washing dishes when Warren came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. She leaned into him with a smile, comfortable with this casual affection that had become part of their daily routine. "I have been thinking," Warren said, his breath warm against her ear. "About what?" "About how lucky I am. I sent for a wife because I needed someone to cook and clean, and instead I got you." Zelda turned in his arms to face him, her hands resting on his chest. "And what exactly did you get?" Warren's eyes were warm as they roamed over her face. "A partner, a friend, someone who makes this house feel like a home." He paused, then added more quietly, "Someone I love." Zelda's breath caught. They had not spoken of love before, though she had felt it growing between them like the seedlings in her garden, small and tender but unmistakably alive. "I love you too," she whispered, and watched his face transform with joy. He kissed her then, deep and thorough, and Zelda lost herself in the taste and feel of him. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Warren rested his forehead against hers. "I never expected this," he admitted. "I thought it would be a practical arrangement, nothing more." "Life has a way of surprising us," Zelda said, echoing something her mother used to say. "Sometimes the best things are the ones we did not plan for." As autumn gave way to winter, Zelda settled more fully into her role as Warren's wife and the mistress of the ranch. She joined the ladies' social in town and made friends with the other women, learned to ride so she could accompany Warren when he checked the fence lines, and threw herself into making their first Christmas together special. Violet thrived in school and at the ranch, growing taller and more confident every day. She had always been shy, but here she blossomed, making friends and discovering a love of horses that led Warren to give her a mare of her own for Christmas. The joy on her sister's face as she threw her arms around Warren's neck, calling him the best brother-in-law in the world, made Zelda's eyes mist with tears. "You have given her what I could not," Zelda told Warren later that night as they lay in bed. "A real home. A sense of security. I can never thank you enough for that." Warren pulled her closer. "She is family now. I would do anything for her, same as I would for you." In early spring, Zelda began to suspect she might be pregnant. She waited to be certain before telling Warren, afraid to get his hopes up, but when she finally confirmed it with the doctor in town, she could barely contain her excitement. She told him that evening after supper. Violet had gone upstairs to do her homework, and they were alone in the parlor. Warren was reading the newspaper and Zelda was mending one of his shirts, trying to work up the courage to share her news. "Warren," she said finally, setting down her needlework. He looked up from the paper. "Yes, I have something to tell you." She took a deep breath. "I am with child. We are going to have a baby." For a moment Warren simply stared at her and Zelda began to worry. Then he was across the room, pulling her into his arms, his face buried in her hair. "Truly." His voice was muffled but thick with emotion. "Truly. The doctor confirmed it today. The baby should come in early October." Warren pulled back to look at her, and Zelda was stunned to see tears in his eyes. "I never dared to hope," he said roughly. A wife I loved, a child on the way, it seemed like too much to ask for. Zelda cupped his face in her hands. You deserve every happiness, Warren Finch. You are a good man, and you are going to be a wonderful father. That night they made love with a new tenderness, Warren's hands reverent on her still flat stomach, and Zelda felt so full of love and gratitude she thought she might burst with it. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the spring and summer. Zelda continued to manage the household, though Warren became increasingly protective, not wanting her to overexert herself. He hired a woman from town to come help with the heavier cleaning, despite Zelda's protests that she was perfectly capable. "Humor me," he said, kissing her forehead. "I need to know you and the baby are safe." Violet was thrilled at the prospect of becoming an aunt and helped Zelda prepare the smallest bedroom as a nursery. They sewed tiny clothes and blankets, painted the room a soft yellow, and Warren built a beautiful cradle from oak wood, sanding it until it was smooth as silk. In early October, Zelda's labor began in the middle of the night. Warren immediately sent Jake racing into town to fetch the doctor and Mrs. Porter, who had offered to help with the birth. Then he paced the bedroom like a caged animal while Zelda tried to breathe through the contractions. "You should go downstairs," Zelda gasped between pains. "This could take hours." "I am not leaving you," Warren said firmly, coming to take her hand. When Mrs. Porter arrived with the doctor, she shooed Warren out of the room despite his protests. Zelda could hear him pacing in the hallway, and the sound was oddly comforting, knowing he was right there. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. There were moments when Zelda thought she could not endure another contraction, when the pain seemed endless and overwhelming. But Mrs. Porter held her hand and encouraged her, and the thought of Warren waiting just outside the door gave her strength. Finally, as the sun was setting on the second day, the doctor told her to push, and with one final tremendous effort, Zelda brought her child into the world. The baby's cry filled the room, strong and healthy, and Zelda collapsed back against the pillows with tears streaming down her face. "It is a boy," the doctor announced, placing the squirming infant on Zelda's chest. "A fine, healthy boy." Zelda looked down at her son, at his red face and dark hair and tiny fists waving in the air, and felt a love so fierce and immediate it took her breath away. "Hello, little one," she whispered. Mrs. Porter went to the door to call Warren in, and he entered the room with a face full of anxiety that transformed into wonder when he saw the baby. He approached the bed slowly, almost reverently, and sat down beside Zelda. "Can I hold him?" he asked, his voice hushed. Zelda carefully transferred the baby into his arms, and Warren cradled his son with surprising confidence for someone who had never held an infant before. He gazed down at the tiny face with an expression of such pure love that Zelda felt fresh tears spring to her eyes. "He is perfect," Warren said. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names during the pregnancy but had not settled on anything definite. Looking at her husband holding their son, Zelda thought of Warren's father, the man who had built this ranch and made this life possible. "What was your father's name?" she asked. "William." "Then let us call him William Warren Finch," Zelda suggested. "Will for short." Warren's eyes shone. He would have been honored. He looked down at the baby. "Hello, Will. Welcome to the ranch." The next few weeks were a blur of sleepless nights and endless feedings, but Zelda had never been happier. Warren was an attentive father, rising with her in the night to change diapers and rock Will when he fussed. Violet was completely smitten with her nephew and could often be found standing by the cradle, singing softly to him. As winter approached again, Zelda sometimes found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. Just over a year ago, she had been a desperate woman in Boston, answering an advertisement from a stranger because she had no other options. Now she had a husband she loved, a beautiful son, a sister who was thriving, and a home that filled her heart with contentment. One evening, as she sat in the rocking chair nursing Will while Warren read aloud from a book and Violet worked on her schoolwork at the table, Zelda felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over her. This was what family was supposed to feel like, safe and warm and full of love. Warren looked up from his book and caught her watching him. "What are you thinking about?" he asked with a smile. "How much my life has changed since I arrived here," Zelda said. "How lucky I am." Warren set down the book and came to crouch beside the rocking chair, placing his hand gently on Will's head. "I am the lucky one. You took a chance on a stranger, and you gave me everything I did not know I was missing." Zelda leaned down to kiss him softly. "We are both lucky then." As Will grew from an infant to a chubby, curious baby, the ranch thrived. Warren expanded his herd and bought more land, making the ranch one of the most successful in the area. Zelda's garden flourished, providing fresh vegetables through the summer and preserved goods for the winter. Violet excelled in school and began talking about becoming a teacher herself someday. In the summer of 1878, when Will was not quite 2 years old, Zelda discovered she was pregnant again. This time she told Warren immediately, unable to contain the news. His reaction was just as joyful as the first time, though tempered with the experience of knowing how difficult pregnancy and childbirth could be. "I will take care of you," he promised, his hand splayed protectively over her stomach. "Both of you." This pregnancy was easier than the first, and in early spring of 1879, Zelda gave birth to a daughter. The labor was shorter and less intense, and when the doctor placed the baby girl in her arms, Zelda looked into eyes the same color as her own and felt her heart expand impossibly further. "She is beautiful," Warren said, sitting beside her on the bed with Will balanced on his knee. The toddler stared at his new sister with wide, curious eyes. "What should we name her?" Zelda asked. Warren thought for a moment. "What was your mother's name?" "Rose." "Rose Finch," Warren tested it out. "I like it. What do you think, Will? Do you like your sister Rose?" Will reached out a chubby hand to touch the baby's face, and Rose wrapped her tiny fingers around his. Zelda watched this first interaction between her children and felt tears slip down her cheeks. "Our family," she said softly. Warren leaned in to kiss her forehead. "Our family," he agreed. Life with 2 young children was chaotic and exhausting and wonderful. Will grew into a sweet-natured boy who followed his father everywhere, already showing an interest in the horses and cattle. Rose was a sunny baby who rarely cried and seemed to delight in everything around her. Violet, now 17 and finished with school, helped tremendously with the children. She had decided she wanted to be a teacher and was studying for the examination that would allow her to apply for positions. Zelda was proud of her sister's ambition and determination, even as she worried about what would happen when Violet eventually left to pursue her own life. But that concern was still in the future. For now, they were all together, a family unit that had been forged from necessity but had become something real and precious. One evening in the fall of 1880, after the children were in bed and Violet was reading in her room, Zelda and Warren sat on the porch watching the sun set over the hills. It had become their habit when the weather was good, this quiet time to reconnect at the end of the day. "Do you ever regret it?" Warren asked suddenly. Zelda turned to look at him in surprise. "Regret what?" "Answering my advertisement. Coming all the way out here to marry a stranger. Sometimes I wonder if you miss your old life." Zelda considered the question seriously, wanting to give him an honest answer. "I miss my parents," she said finally. "I will always miss them, but regret coming here, marrying you. Never. This life, this family, it is everything I could have hoped for and more." Warren reached for her hand, lacing their fingers together. "I think about that day you arrived, how nervous I was. I had no idea how to talk to you, what to say. And then when I saw Violet standing there, this frightened girl, I knew I could not turn you away even if I had wanted to." "You set another plate at the table without a word," Zelda remembered. "That was when I started to believe everything might actually be all right. It was such a small thing." "Small things matter," Zelda said. "They show who a person really is. You have shown me who you are every day since then, Warren, and I fall more in love with you each time." Warren pulled her close, tucking her against his side. They sat like that as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, comfortable in the silence and in each other's presence. The years continued to pass in a rhythm of seasons and growing children. Will started school and proved to be a good student, though his heart was always with the ranch. Rose was her mother's shadow, helping in the garden and the kitchen as soon as she was old enough to be useful. Violet passed her teaching examination with high marks and was offered a position at the school in Concord. She moved into a room at Mrs. Porter's boarding house during the week, but came home to the ranch every weekend. Zelda missed having her sister in the house every day, but was immensely proud of what Violet had accomplished. In 1882, Violet met a young banker named Thomas Reynolds, who had recently moved to Concord from Sacramento. He began courting her with Warren's permission, and by Christmas, they were engaged. Zelda helped her sister plan the wedding, which took place the following spring in the same church where Zelda and Warren had married. Watching Violet walk down the aisle in a beautiful white dress, Zelda felt a bittersweet mixture of joy and nostalgia. Her little sister was all grown up, starting her own family. But when Violet turned to smile at her before taking Thomas's hand, Zelda saw nothing but happiness in her eyes. "She will be all right," Warren murmured, as though reading Zelda's thoughts. "I know," Zelda whispered back. "She has found a good man, just like I did." Violet and Thomas settled in Concord, and soon Zelda was an aunt again when they welcomed their first child, a boy they named Peter. The families remained close, visiting frequently, and Will and Rose adored having a cousin to play with. As the 1880s progressed, the ranch continued to prosper. Warren hired more men and expanded his operations, becoming one of the largest cattle ranchers in the region. But success did not change him. He remained the same quiet, steady, hard-working man Zelda had married, committed to his family and his land. In 1885, Zelda gave birth to their third child, another son they named Samuel after Warren's grandfather. By this time, Will was 7 and Rose was 6, and both children were thrilled to have a baby brother to dote on. Will took his role as big brother seriously, while Rose appointed herself Samuel's guardian and could often be found reading to him or singing lullabies. Warren, now in his mid-30s, had grown even more handsome with age, his face weathered by sun and wind but his eyes still warm when they landed on his family. Zelda, approaching 30 herself, felt she had grown into her role as wife and mother in ways she never could have imagined when she first arrived in California. One day in the summer of 1886, Zelda was in the kitchen preparing preserves when she heard a commotion outside. She wiped her hands and went to investigate, finding Will running toward the house with excitement written all over his face. "Mama, Mama, Papa says we can get a dog. A real cattle dog to help with the herd." Zelda laughed at her son's enthusiasm. Warren came walking up behind Will, a sheepish smile on his face. "I thought it was time," he said. "A ranch needs a good dog, and the children are old enough to help care for it." That afternoon, they drove into town and came home with a border collie puppy they named Scout. The dog quickly became a beloved member of the family, sleeping at the foot of Will's bed and following the children everywhere during the day. Life was full and rich and sometimes chaotic, but Zelda would not have changed a single thing. She had built this life from nothing, had taken a leap of faith on a man she did not know, and had been rewarded beyond measure. On their 10th wedding anniversary in 1886, Warren surprised her by announcing he had arranged for Mrs. Porter to watch the children for the weekend so they could have 2 days to themselves. Zelda was touched by the gesture and excited at the prospect of uninterrupted time with her husband. They spent the weekend at a small hotel in Sacramento, dining in restaurants and walking through the city like they were courting. Without the constant demands of children and ranch work, they rediscovered each other, talking for hours about everything and nothing, making love without worrying about being interrupted. On their last evening before returning home, they sat in their hotel room watching the lights of the city sparkle outside the window. "Thank you for this," Zelda said, curled against Warren's side. "It has been wonderful. I realized we have been so busy with the ranch and the children that we have not had time just for us," Warren said. "I wanted to remind you that you are still my wife, not just the mother of my children." Zelda looked up at him. "I could never forget that. You are the love of my life, Warren Finch. You always will be." Warren kissed her then, deep and slow, and they made love one more time before having to return to reality. The next morning they drove back to the ranch, arriving to find organized chaos. The children rushed out to greet them, all talking at once about what they had done while their parents were away. Samuel, now a year old, toddled toward Warren on unsteady legs, and Warren scooped him up with a laugh. That night, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Zelda stood at the window of their bedroom looking out over the ranch. Warren came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Everything," Zelda said. "How far we have come, how much we have built together. When I got off that stagecoach 10 years ago, I was so frightened. I had no idea what I was walking into. And now I know. I walked into the best life I could have imagined." She turned in his arms to face him. "I love you, Warren. More than words can say." "I love you too," Warren said and kissed her tenderly. "Thank you for taking a chance on me." "Thank you for setting that extra plate," Zelda said, and they both smiled at the memory. As the years continued to pass, the Finch family grew and changed but remained close. Will grew into a young man who had his father's quiet strength and his mother's kindness. He took over more and more of the ranch work, clearly being groomed to eventually inherit the operation. Rose was a spirited girl who loved reading and learning, showing signs that she might follow in her Aunt Violet's footsteps and become a teacher. She was also developing a talent for painting and spent hours capturing the landscape around the ranch on canvas. Samuel was the youngest and perhaps the most mischievous of the three, always getting into some adventure or another. But he had a charm that made it impossible to stay mad at him for long, and he was adored by his older siblings. In 1890, tragedy struck when Thomas Reynolds, Violet's husband, was killed in a bank robbery. Violet, now with 3 children of her own, was devastated. Warren and Zelda immediately insisted she move back to the ranch with her children while she figured out what to do next. Having Violet and her children at the ranch was both a joy and a challenge. The house was crowded and noisy, but it was also filled with life and laughter. Zelda watched her sister slowly emerge from her grief, supported by family and familiar surroundings. "I do not know what I would have done without you and Warren," Violet said one day as they worked together in the kitchen. "You have given me a safe place to heal." "This is your home too," Zelda reminded her. "It always has been, from the moment we arrived here together. Eventually, Violet decided to sell her house in town and build a small cottage on the ranch property, close enough to the main house that the families could remain connected, but far enough to give her some independence. Warren helped with the construction, and by the end of 1891, Violet and her children had their own home. As the new century approached, Zelda found herself reflecting more and more on the journey that had brought her to this point. She was in her 40s now, her children growing up, her life settled into comfortable patterns. But she had never lost the sense of gratitude for what she had found here. One evening in the spring of 1895, the entire family gathered at the ranch for a celebration. Will had just turned 21, and they were marking the occasion with a big dinner. The house was full of noise and laughter, with Violet's children playing with their younger cousins while the adults gathered around the extended table. Zelda looked around at all the faces she loved. Warren at the head of the table, his hair now touched with gray but his smile still making her heart flutter. Will, so grown up and responsible. Rose, beautiful and bright at 16. Samuel at 11, full of energy and questions. Violet and her children, recovered from their loss and thriving. This was the legacy of that single decision made so long ago, to answer an advertisement and travel across the country to marry a stranger. All of these lives, all of this love, had grown from that one act of courage. Warren caught her eye across the table and raised his glass to her, a private toast that said everything without words. Zelda smiled and raised her own glass in return, her heart full to overflowing. After dinner, as the younger children played outside and the older ones helped clean up, Warren took Zelda's hand and led her out to the porch. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and the air was sweet with the scent of blooming flowers from Zelda's garden. "Do you remember our first sunset on this porch?" Warren asked, pulling her close. "I remember every sunset we have shared," Zelda said. "Each one has been a gift." They stood there in comfortable silence, watching the day fade into night, just as they had done countless times over the nearly 20 years of their marriage. And Zelda knew that as long as she had Warren by her side and her family around her, every sunset would continue to be beautiful. In the years that followed, the family continued to grow and change. Will married a sweet girl from town named Catherine, and they had children of their own, giving Warren and Zelda their first grandchildren. Rose did indeed become a teacher, taking a position at a school in San Francisco but coming home often to visit. Samuel showed an interest in becoming a veterinarian and went off to study, though he too remained close to the family. Violet remarried in 1898 to a widowed rancher named George Peterson, and they merged their families with a grace that spoke to the strength of the love they had found in their second chances. Through it all, Warren and Zelda remained the steady center of their growing family. They had weathered storms and hardships, celebrated triumphs and milestones, and their love had only deepened with time. In the fall of 1906, 30 years after Zelda had first arrived in Concord, the entire extended family gathered at the ranch to celebrate Warren and Zelda's anniversary. It was a massive affair, with children and grandchildren filling every corner of the house and spilling out into the yard. At one point, Zelda slipped away from the festivities to catch her breath. She found herself in the kitchen, where it had all really begun, and she smiled at the memories that lived in every corner of this room. Warren found her there, as she had known he would. He came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, just as he had done so many times before. "Hiding from our family?" he asked with amusement. "Just remembering," Zelda said, leaning back against him. "Do you remember the first meal I cooked for you? Biscuits and salt pork," Warren said immediately. And you were so nervous you nearly burned them." "I did not nearly burn them," Zelda protested, laughing. "They were perfect." "They were," Warren agreed, "just like you." Zelda turned in his arms to face him, reaching up to cup his weathered face in her hands. "We have had a good life, have we not?" "The best," Warren said without hesitation. "Better than I ever dreamed possible." "I love you," Zelda said, the words as true now as they had been the first time she spoke them. "I will love you until my last breath and beyond." Warren kissed her then, a kiss that held 30 years of love and partnership and shared history. When they finally broke apart, they were both smiling. "Should we go back to our party?" Zelda asked. "In a minute," Warren said. "I want to remember this moment, just the two of us, before we rejoin the chaos." They stood there in the kitchen, holding each other. Two people who had started as strangers and had built something extraordinary together. Outside, they could hear the laughter and chatter of their family, the legacy of their love made manifest in all those lives. Finally, they walked back out together to rejoin the celebration, hand in hand just as they had been for 30 years. And as Zelda looked around at the children and grandchildren, at Violet and her family, at the ranch that had become a home beyond anything she had imagined, she felt a profound sense of peace. This was what she had been searching for when she stepped off that stage coach so long ago. Belonging, purpose, love. She had found it all in the quiet strength of a cowboy who had set an extra plate without a word, who had welcomed her and her sister into his home and his heart, who had given her everything she needed and so much more than she had dared to hope for. As the evening wore on and the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Warren pulled Zelda onto the makeshift dance floor that had been set up in the yard. They swayed together to the music, and Zelda rested her head on his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of him. "What are you thinking about now?" Warren murmured. "How grateful I am," Zelda said softly, "for all of this, for all of you, for the life we have built together." Warren held her tighter. "I am the grateful one. You gave me a family, a home filled with love, a reason to be more than just a man working his land." "We gave that to each other," Zelda corrected. They danced under the stars, surrounded by the family they had created, and Zelda knew that no matter how many more years they were blessed with, this moment would remain perfect in her memory. The feel of Warren's arms around her, the sound of their grandchildren's laughter, the knowledge that she had found exactly where she belonged. The ranch continued to thrive into the new century, passed down to Will, when Warren eventually decided to retire from the day-to-day operations. But Warren and Zelda remained on the ranch, in the house where they had started their life together, and they spent their golden years surrounded by the love they had cultivated. They took long walks together in the evenings, reminisced about the early days of their marriage, and delighted in watching their grandchildren grow. Zelda continued to tend her garden, which had expanded over the years into something truly spectacular. Warren spent his time working with the horses, unable to fully step away from the work that had defined so much of his life. On a warm evening in the summer of 1915, nearly 40 years after they had first met, Warren and Zelda sat on their porch watching yet another sunset. They were both in their 60s now, their bodies slower than they once were, but their love as strong as ever. "You have any regrets?" Zelda asked, echoing the question Warren had posed to her so many years before. Warren was quiet for a moment, considering. Then he squeezed her hand and said, "Not a single one. Everything I am, everything I have is because you took a chance on me." "We took a chance on each other," Zelda said, "and look what we created." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant colors. And as darkness fell and the first stars appeared, Zelda reflected on the extraordinary gift of this ordinary life. A love that had started as convenience and had grown into something deep and true. A family built on a foundation of kindness and commitment. A home that had weathered every storm. She thought about that frightened young woman who had stepped off the stagecoach with her sister in tow, desperate and uncertain. She thought about the quiet cowboy who had set an extra plate at the table without hesitation, who had shown her through actions rather than words what kind of man he was. And she thought about all the moments in between, all the small choices and gestures that had woven their lives together into something beautiful. "What are you smiling about?" Warren asked, noticing the expression on her face. "Everything," Zelda said simply. "Absolutely everything." Warren leaned over and kissed her cheek, a gesture as natural as breathing after all these years. "I love you, Zelda Finch, and I love you, Warren Finch, always and forever." They sat together on the porch until the stars filled the sky. Two people who had found in each other everything they had been searching for and so much more. And as they finally rose to go inside, Warren took Zelda's hand just as he had done countless times before, and they walked together into the warmth of their home, surrounded by the echoes of all the love and life they had shared. The story of their love would be passed down through generations, told and retold by their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. It would become a family legend, this tale of a mail-order bride who brought her younger sister, and the cowboy who set another plate without a word, and how from that simple act of kindness grew a love that lasted a lifetime and beyond. And in the years to come, when people spoke of Warren and Zelda Finch, they would speak of a love that was built not on grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but on the steady accumulation of small kindnesses, shared moments, and unwavering commitment. They would speak of a partnership that weathered every challenge and celebrated every joy, of two people who chose each other every single day and built something extraordinary from that choice. The ranch remained in the family for generations, a testament to everything Warren and Zelda had built together. And on quiet evenings, when the sun set over those same golden hills, their descendants would sometimes gather on that same porch and feel the presence of that enduring love, as real and tangible as the land beneath their feet. For Zelda and Warren had proven that sometimes the greatest love stories are not about fate or destiny, but about choice and commitment, and the courage to take a chance on a stranger who might just become everything you never knew you needed. They had shown that love is not just a feeling but an action, demonstrated in countless small ways every single day. And though the years eventually caught up with them, as years inevitably do, their love remained eternal, woven into the very fabric of the ranch and the family they had created. Warren and Zelda Finch lived out their days together in the home they had built, surrounded by the love they had nurtured. And when they finally passed, they did so knowing they had lived a life rich with purpose and meaning and joy. Their story ended as all stories must, but the legacy of their love continued on through their children and grandchildren, through the ranch that still stood strong, through the lessons they had taught about kindness and commitment, and the power of choosing love every single day. And somewhere in the vast expanse of time and memory, that moment lived on forever. A young woman arriving in a strange town with nothing but hope and her sister's hand in hers. A quiet cowboy setting an extra plate at the table without a word, and the beginning of a love story that would span decades and touch countless lives. It was a simple story, really, about simple people living simple lives. But it was also a story of extraordinary love found in the most ordinary of circumstances, of two people who built a life and a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. And in the end, That was all that mattered. The love they shared, the family they created, the home they built together. Everything else was just details in the grand tapestry of a life well lived and a love that would never fade. Warren and Zelda Finch had found their happily ever after, not in a fairy tale ending, but in the daily reality of choosing each other, supporting each other, and loving each other through every season of life. And that, perhaps, was the greatest love story of all.